Hello and welcome to our next NAP. My name is Irina Ryshkova and I'm your nonprofit auditor. These are weekly NAPs. NAP stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points, and I created these points to help nonprofit organizations, board members, finance team, accounting team, to explain some accounting and audit related issues. These NAPs are not authoritative, and they just simply me sharing my experience with nonprofit community. I really hope that you will find them useful, and let's start. Today I would like to talk about why it is so critical to retain communications from the donors. In the sense, when the donors make any pledges to nonprofit organization. So nonprofits operate primarily from receiving grants, donations, contributions, pledges. They receive them from individual donors, from foundations, from funds, from other nonprofits, from government agencies, from various entities. And every pledge comes with some sort of communication from the donor. It can be form of email, could be grant letter, could be verbal communication, could be a very short email, could be written letter, could be a lot of various communication, can be conversation that was between the organization and the donor. But they're typically not very common when donation just appears in your bank statement, or the check, even a check when it appears to in the mail, sometimes in the subject line it has some notation. So when the nonprofit receives some sort of grant or contribution or donation or pledge, it's all the same. They all do various gifts to nonprofit. They do come with some communication from the donor. And from the revenue recognition and in nonprofit income and understanding donor support, it's very critical for nonprofit not only understand the donor wishes, requirements, but also nonprofit is required to obey to those wishes of donor. Because at the end of the day, nonprofits, 501c3 organizations required, they supported by public, and they have to obey to the wishes of their donors. Therefore, communications that nonprofit receive with the revenue, with a gift, with a pledge, important to understand the donor intent. If there's any conditions that donor puts in the gift, any restrictions that donor also specify, and other important issues such as reporting requirements and other compliances that donor would like to nonprofit to follow. As an auditor, I can add that very often when we audit revenue for nonprofits, we do not look just in the bank statement to see how much money arrived. Revenue recognition has very little to do with actual amount of funds received. We need to understand what was the donor wishes intent, because conditions, restrictions, and total amount of pledge you cannot observe from the bank statement. Therefore, once again, it is critical for nonprofit organization to maintain these communications, save them and keep them as long as the nonprofit still uses the grant funds. So if it's multi-year grant that can span over several years, 2, 3, 5, and longer, nonprofit is required to maintain all these communications for that number of years, and maybe plus more, depending on your routine documentation policy of your nonprofit. Okay, so let's let's go a little bit deeper and see what exactly it means, what everything that I explained above. So understanding the donor intent. So donor intent is fundamental to nonprofit organization because this is organization rules how a nonprofit can spend the money. So initial communication with the donor is setting expectations how the funds can be utilized. Again, it doesn't matter how big the donation is. Donor can make very small donation but put a lot of restrictions and conditions. So therefore, again, communication is very critical for nonprofit to understand what the donor wants to do. For example, donor can give a donation for a specific project. It's going to be restricted by a purpose. Or donor can give the money that's going to be spent over 2 or 3 years. It's going to be restricted by time. Donor can give the funds, it's going to say you can only entitle to these funds if you're going to match with another donor funds. Then it's conditional. You don't even recognize revenue. A lot of donations can put a budget that restrict nonprofit to spend money only for these specific line items. Some nonprofits can give, some donors can give money saying you cannot, absolutely not use it for fundraising and other admin activities, only for program. So there's a lot, and donors are absolutely free to put any conditions and restrictions they would like to on their donation. It's in their power because they provide money. Government grants have even more restrictions. They might demand specific type of audits, specific type of requirements, specific type of the internal policy and procedures. That everything that I'm explaining right now, it's very critical because I want to emphasize that it's absolutely critical and vital for nonprofit to have all the grant letters, all the communication from the funder with the full grants, including appendices, any supplements, extensions that you nonprofits received. Save them in your permanent file and maintain them as long as the grant's still in use. But before the grant is going to be actually be used by nonprofit and record as revenue, all of these communication is very critical for nonprofits to understand whether or not this pledge is actually represents unconditional promise. Why? Because if the promise is conditional, nonprofit needs to meet that condition even before starting using funds. So conditional promises are not actually donations, they're not pledges, because there's some condition involved, and that condition needs to be understood. Because the most significant error that nonprofit can do, it's recognize conditional promise as a revenue, later realizing it was a conditional promise, and the funder will ask for money back. Therefore, when nonprofit receive a pledge, a grant, that is nonprofit needs to read to see if there is any condition. And condition exists when there's two prongs are present. They both have to be present. Barrier and right of return of the funds. So donor might say nonprofit needs to meet any specific measurable barrier. Important words here: specific, measurable, objectively measurable barriers. For example, nonprofit needs to provide 125 meals to homeless shelters. Very specific, very measurable. This is a barrier. And if that barrier is not met, nonprofits needs to return funds if there were any prepayment from the donor, right? So this barrier needs to be met, and if it's not met, the funds needs to be returned. So both barriers, condition exists if there is measurable specific barrier and the right of return the funds. If such barrier exists, the promise is conditional and no revenue is recognized when the promise is made. Again, why it's important to understand the communication from the funder to see if there is any conditions. If you will see a barrier, but there is no right of return the funds, there is no condition. If you see right of return the funds as a language in the grant, but there is no measurable barrier, there is no condition. Sometimes you might have a grant and you will read and you will see, when we satisfied, then you have to return the funds. Upon our satisfaction. Satisfaction and reporting requirements do not create barriers. Barriers needs to be specific. For example, nonprofit needs to attend the conference. For example, nonprofits need to serve X amount of meals during this year. For example, nonprofit needs to hold a fundraising event in this year. Or, for example, nonprofit needs to hire this specific scientist to do the work. So that it has to be objectively measurable. The barrier cannot be vague and subjectively understood. It needs to be understood by every party in order to create a barrier, plus right of return. And again, both needs to be present. So that's a condition. Okay, if we determine there is no condition, then nonprofit needs to continue analyzing what is the wish of donor and see if there is any restriction. Restrictions can come in the form of time or purpose. If we see that a grant letter or communication specifically makes use of funds narrower than the purpose of the mission, for example, purpose of the mission to support Grape Apes overall, but the grant letter specifically saying this is for Grape Apes in New York, then we know it's make it narrower to geographic location, right? Or if it's restricted by time, when it says you have to, this is the funds to support the organization for over the period of 3 years. So we know that donor is specifically asking nonprofit spend this money over 3-year period. So it's restricted by time. Again, it's also important because nonprofits need to, that's going to be important for revenue recognition, restricted or non-restricted revenue, and for net assets with donor restrictions, you will be required to keep them as restricted for the purpose or restricted by time. Again, very critical, and this understanding can only come from the communication with the donor. Therefore, it's important for nonprofit to understand if there is communication from the donor that has some restriction, and we as an auditor, when we audit, we ask for support to see what was the communication from the donor, what if there's any restrictions. Other very critical information that nonprofit will learn from the communication from the donor if there is any reporting requirements. Some grants actually require very detailed financial reporting. Some may be required weekly, monthly, at the end of the grant. Some require just very high-level narrative. Some require very detailed financial reporting. Some might actually require to do on-site inspection when the donor can come and inspect, do a little audit related to this funder, and they will ask all the support participants to see all information. And it's very critical because nonprofit need to understand what possibly can happen, so they set up their policy and procedures and to retain required detailed information. Unfortunately, we've seen in our practice when the nonprofit does not meet those requirements, and donor might actually either stop any future funding or even ask for money back. And as I mentioned before, it's also important for audits. Depending what type of audit nonprofit will be required to be performed. For example, if we performing regular financial audit, we're not as concerned of the compliance portion of funders, but if the nonprofit is required to performing single audit or any other compliance audits, then auditor will need to make sure that nonprofit is complying with the donor requirements, and that compliance can only come from the documentation from the donor that asking for these compliance areas. And as the auditor, we need to audit, independently verify that nonprofit actually maintain the policy procedures and compliant with the wishes and conditions and restrictions that donor imposed. And if the nonprofits did not comply, these deficiencies and findings will go directly on an audit report. To conclude, revenue area for nonprofits, it's important not only for operating standpoint, because nonprofits can only sustain its operations if it brings enough funds, and it is very critical for nonprofits to diversify its revenue streams and bring income from special events, from donation, from earned revenue, from grants, from various sources, which is wonderful. It makes nonprofit very sustainable. However, it also makes nonprofit very complicated and challenging to comply with various revenue streams. So the most critical and time-consuming and challenging, it's maintaining compliance with the contributions, grants, because these represents promises, gifts, pledges, and very often they come with the strings attached by donor, and the donors can freestyle their conditions, restrictions, and other requirements that they want nonprofits to follow, because they freestyle and very custom for every various grant. Nonprofit needs to be sophisticated enough to read, understand, and document and retain all these requirements that come from the donor and follow them and be able to report back their compliance to the donor and to the auditor. Thank you so much. Hopefully that was useful. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully it will help your nonprofit to be more compliant and bring more funds to sustain the operation of your nonprofit. Thank you for being here with me. Have a wonderful day. Until the next time, Irina Ryzhkova, your nonprofit auditor. Bye.